So this module is probably one of the ones that our MCTs are most familiar with when it comes to working with relational data stores in the cloud.
Exactly, and I just want to iterate, we deliberately put this like pretty much in the middle of the course, you know, because we didn't want to set the expectation with your students that data engineering is primarily about relational. It's just as important as every other module that we've seen. They're all important. In data engineering, they're all important. But you're going to be very, very comfortable with this. And here are the lesson objectives.
But to do some expectation settings on this is really about relational data stores in the context of data engineering, right? We're not talking about data management. We're not talking about backup and restore, high availability. That's not the purpose of relational data stores in the context of data engineering.
That's a really fair point to bring up. So this is why Azure SQL database is one lesson. Because that's really all that it needs.
And if you were to look at it from a data management, you would arguably say this is a 3-day course just by itself. Same thing with SQL Data Warehouse.
Correct. If we're going to talk about that data management feature, that's exactly what it would be. So our focus here is really a little bit more on data warehouse, just from the perspective that maybe some of you, we think that your students will be very comfortable with SQL database, but SQL Data Warehouse and the way you load data is relatively new to some people. So that's where we focused on that.
But when we think about that, that's also where Polybase will come in, and where we have to think about, hey, Polybase capability in SQL Data Warehouse, Polybase in SQL Server 2019, you name it.
Well, that's a really good point, right? Because Polybase is ubiquitous. It's not just specific to SQL Data Warehouse. So I'm really glad you've brought that point up. So lesson 1 is working with Azure SQL Database. Lesson 2 is working with SQL Data Warehouse. Lesson 3, we provision and query data in Azure SQL Data Warehouse. And lesson 4 is the importing of data into Azure SQL Data Warehouse using Polybase.
Which is what? The fastest way to import data in
it is. So there's many different ways you can load data into Azure SQL Data Warehouse. You could use SYS if you want to. It's not the most optimal way.
So let's quickly browse through some of these lessons. And quite frankly, I think this is a module where pretty much anyone that has been delivering SQL training will be very much in their comfort zone.
Great.
Where you could provide that additional knowledge that students might be looking for.
Of course.
Because you're skilled on it.
I think it's more instilling confidence in them more than anything, into the students more than anything. I think that's what this is about. Because if you look at the lessons, there's 4 lesson objectives here. You know, really it's about why is Azure SQL Database a good choice? What are the configuration and pricing options? A recurring theme, how to create it in the portal. And how you can use Azure Cloud Shell to connect to SQL database, add a table and work with data. You can all do that without me going
And
into
are we
that.
tackling things here like elastic pooling and all of that? Or?
Yeah, so we call out the options that in the configuration and pricing options, but I didn't go too deep because that's coming up with the SQL migrations course that we're coming up with. So really, there's not really any particular slide that I want to focus on here.
Yeah, but you got it covered. Elastic pool, managed instance.
Exactly. And then creating the database itself and using the Cloud Shell to actually write in commands.
So while I do think that SQL database and SQL Data Warehouse is important,
of course they are.
Primarily within the context of data management and how it fits from a relational store in data engineering, to me it feels like, from an exam perspective, it's probably just a fraction of knowledge that you need to know within that entire data engineering.
Azure SQL Data Warehouse and SQL Database together is what, 10%? Definitely.
Right.
So you get your review questions. I think the danger here actually for MCTs, if I'm being honest, is that you spend too much time on that first bit. Rein it in. We've just got to be so careful. I've been there and made that mistake.
Balance it, because I could talk for 3 days based on my subject matter expertise.
So in lesson 2, we're looking at Azure SQL Data Warehouse, and here are the lesson objectives. We've got 5 of them. We're going to list the types of data warehousing solutions. We're going to explain Azure SQL Data Warehouse. I think, not necessarily from an exam perspective, but from a background perspective, you're going to get asked a lot about massively parallel processing concepts. It's a really good opportunity to kind of say, this is how massive parallel processing works in Azure SQL Data Warehouse. Not too dissimilar with other big data technologies either. Table geometries are really important to understand. This is how
Which
tables...
goes into replicated tables.
Yes, and how data is distributed across the
Okay.
MPP architecture.
Makes sense.
And as ever, how to create and provision an Azure SQL data warehouse. What we've got here is an acknowledgement of Kimball and Iman architectures and the difference between enterprise data warehousing, data marts, and operational data stores. This will be stuff that you'll be very familiar with, particularly if you did the data warehousing exams. But then we really focus on, what are the key selling points of moving to Azure SQL data warehouse? It's elastic, it's a full managed service by Microsoft, and it supports your smallest to largest data sets. I have literally seen data loads that take hours to run go to minutes. It's brilliant. So it scales to petabytes of data. It uses a massive parallel processing. It's powered by the cloud, so you get all the goodness it's enterprise ready, and it can integrate with a wide range of other Azure solutions. And finally, it's very, very competitively priced. Okay.
And I feel like you're selling me on something I'm already convinced about.
Oh, that's fine. So we move on very quickly then to what I enjoy. I love this slide. Basically, it's giving you the opportunity to talk about the architecture within Azure SQL Data Warehouse, in how it's able to get that scale, right? And on the left, you've got the control node, which is the brains of the operation, really. And the purple bricks, so to speak, is where you've got compute nodes that do what I call the grunt work. So a query that comes in really goes to the control node that then decides where it should get processed. So the query comes in, that gets pushed down to the various compute nodes that do the work, that returns the answer back to the control node. And that is, in essence, how all big data architectures work at a high level.
Makes sense.
But within that, you've got to have tables that take advantage of that distributed nature. So the table geometries works on the basis of distribution. So you need to understand what a hash is. You need to understand what a round robin is, and we'll just pause there for a moment, because the reality is that round robin is really good for load scenarios, right? The data is indiscriminately placed in any distribution regardless of what values are there. So really good for loading scenarios. And hash is where you're actually assigning a column on which the data, it's the basis for which the data is being distributed. So that basically means you're going thinking about partitioning a little bit. You're thinking about what column should I use as the basis for my hash, so you get that even distribution of data. A feature that's been introduced recently, really, is the replicated table, where you got a copy of the entire table. This works really well for small dimension tables, And the reason why we're doing this is, at the end of the day, doing join queries in SQL Data Warehouse does require pulling data from different distributions. So if a small table is replicated on every distribution, you're reducing the data movement. Okay. So once they understand that, go into the portal, show them how to create an Azure SQL Data Warehouse, and then you've got the review question. So at that stage, you've just provisioned it. What we then look at is how we create and query it. And there are 3 objectives here. So again, we can create the Azure SQL Data Warehouse, but this time we can choose the sample database. So it's to show students that they can work with this today without any of their data at all. And then the rest of this is going to be really, really straightforward, to be honest. So here you'll notice that the select source, instead of it being a blank database, you'll choose sample database. Back to the query basics again.
Makes sense.
And finally, we call out the fact that there are additional types of SQL statements that you need to be familiar with. Create table select is going to be really important in the next lesson. Okay, so spend some time on this.
Makes sense.
And then, how can you query it? Well, you've got an example of SQL Server Management Studio that can connect up to it. Or you could use Power BI, you could use Visual Studio. There's a wide range of options. And then you've got review questions there, which then takes us into lesson 4.
And that's a really important one.
It is. And I'm not saying it's really important in the real world, not certification. You just need to learn it for certification, but it's just so important, right? Why? Because Most of the problems that I think at Microsoft we face when it's come to people complaining about load speeds is usually because the customers use the wrong method of loading.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Yep.
So they're using integration services, or they're using BCP when they should be using Polybase.
Totally agree.
And this is where you get the ability to take all the learnings of massive parallel processing and then apply it to Polybase.
And this is a great example too, where you're now going to be using blob storage as your core data store to bring it into Polybase and
exactly
take advantage of that.
So you're right. It could be blob store, it could be data lake store that acts as the temporary staging area. Because think about it, right? A lot of data warehouses are based on transactional systems, right? Which are typically, even if it's not SQL Server, it's some form of OLTP system. Well, you need to stage that somewhere. But actually, as you'll find out in this lesson, you need to stage it really as files in order to take advantage of that parallelism. And let's have a look at this, because what you're seeing here really is the MPP processing engine, just in a different way. So if you look at the purple box with the MPP data warehouse engine, you've got the control node again, and you've got the compute nodes. But underneath those compute nodes, you've got the data movement service, right? And what you'll see here is that if you've got your files in Azure Blob or Data Lake, right, fundamentally, that's just a big data store, right? So for each file that you have, that can be parallelized across the range of compute nodes. How do you choose compute nodes? It's based on your data warehouse units, the sliding scale. The higher it is, the more you have, basically.
Very straightforward.
Yeah, it is. But it just means that you have a different approach to ETL than you may have been used to with on-premises solutions.
Well, I mean, the thing is, if you're going to be using Polybase, you're pretty much just ingesting the data without any form of manipulation.
Correct.
Which you typically would do with SQL integration services or Data Factory otherwise.
Sure.
Right?
And this is where you can like put things all together, right? Well, maybe what I will have in Azure SQL Data Warehouse are staging tables with round robin, just load it in with Polybase so it's evenly distributed, and then I'll worry about loading to dimension tables and fact tables further in. So upload text data to Azure Blob Store. You already did this in Module 2, so you don't really, you're just reminding them. But you may have an automated process, by the way, where you're using SQL Server integration services, collecting it all from your on-premises, and then placing it in Azure Blob as text files. That you might, so it doesn't just have to be this way. But in order for Azure SQL Data Warehouse to access that blob store, you have to collect the keys for the blob store. So we talk about that. And then you create an Azure Data Warehouse if you haven't got one already. And once that's done, you import the data from the blob store, and you do this by creating an external data source. Right? The important thing here is the name, which is in a slightly different text color. FXR test description. Step 2, create an external file format, which is telling Polybase what is the format of the files that you're processing. So here we've got a situation where we've got a name of that object in a different text. So it's FXR test format, and this is basically using delimited text with a new row for field termination. And string delimiters with single quotes. And then on the other page, we create a new external table in SQL Server. So we create an external table with whatever columns you want to name and this is where the work from the previous slide comes into play. Data source with the name that we just mentioned, file format with the name that we create for that object. You can optionally add reject type and values to have some rudimentary error controls in there for aborting load should you get so many errors.
Looks like we're teaching people some German in this sample.
Oh, this was because of a customer that I work with in, and then you create an external table with that, and you use a CTAS statement in order to load it. So create external table as, and then you put all those options there with the select statement underneath to load it. They do all of this in the lab. From data in the blob store from module 2.
Makes sense.
So there is dependencies there. So you can see how all this is linking up together. Go through the review questions. The lab in module 1, in lab, All you're doing in Objective 1 is you're just provisioning a Shore SQL database.
That makes sense.
If you read the case study and the lab overview, you'll understand that it's not actually you doing it in the case study. Your junior DBAs are doing it, just getting it ready. But 2, 3, and 4 is all about Azure SQL Data Warehouse, where you provision it, you create it, you query it, and then you use Polybase to load data. In Module 2, you load a date text file in Azure Blob as part of that lab. You're loading that to replace a dim date.
Okay.
So there's the scenario behind it. There are the review questions to promote discussions around it. And finally, you do the module summary. I did a lot of work with the data warehouse team a couple of years ago. So if you wanted some background and got that link down there, takes you to Channel 9 with how to do it from start to finish. Yeah, and it has yours truly doing that. So
okay, sounds
good. That's working relational data stores. Do not get caught up with spending hours on this, or else you will run out of time.
People might do when they're.
I've done it
very well in their comfort zone.
Exactly, I've done that.
Okay, perfect. Let's take it to the next module, and thanks for joining us on this one.
Thank you.